The replacement's name was Davis, Private First Class William Davis, fresh from a training depot in California that smelled of pine needles and discipline, neither of which did a man a lick of good out here. Here in the Philippines, in the spring of 1945, the only things you could smell were mud, rot, and fear. He stood before me, a scarecrow in a brand new uniform that was still stiff and ridiculously green, against the jungle's endless, suffocating palette of brown and decaying vegetation. He was maybe 18 with a face that hadn't yet decided if it belonged to a boy or a man, all sharp angles and big, nervous eyes that darted around like a cornered animal. My platoon, what was left of it, looked him over with the dead-eyed indifference of men who had seen too many fresh faces come and go. We were down to 28 men from the original 42 that had landed on this godforsaken island. The empty spaces in our ranks were like ghosts that marched with us, a constant silent reminder of the cost of every ridge, every river crossing, every stinking, malaria-infested swamp. And now, command had sent us this. Davis. He looked like he couldn't lift his own pack, let alone carry the weight of the man next to him. "Sergeant Miller?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last syllable. He held out his transfer papers, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. I didn't take them. I just looked him up and down. His boots were clean, an unforgivable sin. "We don't get many tourists in this part of the world, son," I said, my voice flat and hard. It was the only tone I had left. The war had boiled away all the softer notes. "What's your specialty, Private? What gift did the United States Army send us all the way from the land of milk and honey?" "I was trained on the M1 rifle, Sergeant," he said, trying to stand a little straighter, "and the Browning automatic rifle, and grenades. And—" "I'm not asking what you were trained on," I cut him off. "A monkey can be trained to pull a trigger. I'm asking what you're good at. You a mechanic, a cook? You know how to play the harmonica? Anything that might actually be useful." He looked confused. I'm a good shot, Sergeant. Back home in Montana, Montana, I grunted, finally taking the papers from his hand. The name fit. He looked like he'd be more at home chasing sheep than hunting men. "Well, you ain't in Montana anymore. The only things to shoot at out here, shoot back. And they're a hell of a lot better at it than you are. Find a spot. Dig a hole. Try not to get yourself or anyone else killed." He scurried away like a kicked dog, joining a group of veterans who immediately turned their backs on him. I watched him go, a sour taste in my mouth. I hated new men. I hated their clean uniforms, their naive optimism, and the innocent, terrified hope in their eyes. They were a liability. They didn't know the sounds of the jungle, the difference between a falling coconut and a mortar round. They didn't know how to move, how to stay quiet, how to smell a trap. They were walking body bags, and it was my job to keep them zipped up as long as possible, usually at the expense of a better man's life. This kid, Davis, he had victim written all over him. The first test came that same afternoon during the daily rain. It wasn't really rain, more like the sky falling down in a solid, warm sheet. It turned our foxholes into muddy bathtubs and the whole world into a gray, dripping misery. With the rain came the artillery. The Japanese were crafty. They knew the deluge would muffle the sound of their guns, giving us less time to take cover. The first shell landed 100 yards away with a crump that was half drowned by the storm. "Incoming!" someone screamed, and the veterans vanished, melting into the earth as if by magic. I dove into my own hole, landing in a foot of stinking water, and peered over the edge. Davis was frozen in the open, standing stock still like one of his beloved Montana deer caught in the headlights. He was staring at the spot where the shell had landed, his mouth hanging open, his rifle dangling, forgotten in his hand. Another shell screamed in, closer this time. The explosion sent a geyser of mud and shrapnel into the air. "Get down, you damn fool!" I roared. He didn't move. He was paralyzed, a statue of pure, unadulterated terror. He was going to die, right here, right now, on his first day. Cursing a blue streak, I scrambled out of my hole and sprinted towards him, my boots sucking at the mud. The air whistled, the sound of a fast-approaching mail train from hell. I didn't have time to be gentle. I hit him with a flying tackle, driving him face first into the mud just as the shell impacted 20 feet away. The world dissolved into a deafening roar and a blast of hot, wet air that tried to tear the skin from my bones. We lay there for a moment, mud in our mouths, ears ringing. I pushed myself up, my whole body aching. What the hell is wrong with you? I spat, hauling him to his feet. You want to die? Is that it? You want to go home in a box? He just stared at me, his face pale and slick with rain and mud. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. He couldn't speak. He was useless, worse than useless. He was a danger to himself and everyone around him. I had to risk my own neck to save his. Later, after the shelling stopped, I made the platoon strip and clean their rifles. It was a ritual, a way to bring order back to the chaos. I walked the line, inspecting each weapon. When I got to Davis, he was struggling with his M1. He couldn't get the bolt to slide smoothly. He had gotten mud in the action, and instead of cleaning it properly, he was just making it worse. Give me that, it snapped, snatching the rifle from him. In 30 seconds, I had it field stripped. I pointed to a clump of gritty mud packed into the receiver. You see this? This is what gets you killed. This right here. Your rifle is your life. It's more important than your mother, your girl, or whatever stupid cow you left behind in Montana. You treat it like a piece of junk, it'll perform like one, and you'll be dead. I threw the pieces back at him. Clean it, and if I ever see it in this condition again, I'll personally wrap it around your neck. The veterans watched, their faces impassive. They had seen this before. It was part of the process, the breaking in of a new cog in the machine. But with Davis, it felt different. It felt like trying to sharpen a piece of wood. The kid was just too soft. That night, I assigned him the second watch. I knew he wouldn't sleep a wink before it, his mind filled with the terror of the shelling. Good. Maybe a little fear would wake him up. When I handed him the watch roster, he looked at me with those big, pleading eyes. Don't you worry, kid, a veteran named Preacher drawled from the next foxhole. The Japs always attack on the third watch. It was a lie, but Davis didn't know that. The look of pure dread on his face was almost comical. I walked away without a word. He was a burden, a millstone around the neck of my platoon, and I had a sinking feeling that he was going to drag us all down with him. 2 days later, the new lieutenant showed up. His name was Harris, a fresh-faced West Point graduate with a crisp uniform and a map case that looked like it had never been opened. He was full of theories and tactics he'd learned from a book, and he had the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been shot at. In other words, he was the most dangerous thing in the jungle. He called me to his tent, a ridiculously large affair that screamed, "Officer," to any enemy sniper within a mile. He had a map spread out on a folding table, and he pointed a manicured finger at a ridgeline 3 miles to our north. "Here, Sergeant," he said, his voice buzzing with enthusiasm. "This is our objective. Hill 488. Intelligence says it's a key observation post, but it's only lightly defended. A quick surgical strike. We go in at dawn, secure the ridge, and we'll have eyes on the entire valley." I looked at the map, then back at him. I had learned to read maps not just as lines on a page, but as promises of pain. I saw steep inclines, thick jungle, and a single exposed approach. It stank. "Intelligence, sir?" I asked. "The same intelligence that said the beach would be a cakewalk? The same intelligence that said the last village was friendly?" Harris's smile tightened. "I trust the intel, Sergeant. It's our job to execute. We'll move out at 400. I want your best men on point." I knew a brick wall when I saw one. Arguing would be useless. "Yes, sir," I said. I walked back to my men, a cold dread settling in my gut. A green lieutenant and a bad plan. It was the oldest story in the book, and it always ended in a flag-draped coffin. I gathered my squad leaders, old hands like Preacher and a tough kid from East LA. We called Brooklyn and laid out the mission. They saw the same things I did. They didn't say a word, just nodded grimly. Then I saw Davis. He was trying to dig his foxhole deeper, but he was all thumbs, the entrenching tool an alien object in his hands. He was making a mess of it, a shallow, lopsided scrape that wouldn't stop a well-aimed rock. He was pathetic, and a thought cold and cruel slid into my mind. I was going to lose good men on this mission, men with wives and kids, men I trusted, all for a stupid, pointless attack on a hill that was probably a trap. And this kid, this walking disaster, would be right in the middle of it, a loose gear ready to jam the whole machine. But what if he wasn't? I walked over to him. He flinched as my shadow fell over him, expecting another tongue lashing. "Stop that," I said, gesturing at the hole. "You're an embarrassment. Pack your gear You've got a new assignment." A flicker of hope ignited in his eyes. He probably thought I was sending him to the rear. I took him over to my own map, a dirty, sweat-stained rag compared to the lieutenant's pristine document. I pointed to another ridge, a smaller, lower one, about a mile to the west of our main objective. "You see this?" I said. "This is your hill. You're going to take a spool of commo wire and a field telephone. You're going to climb that ridge, find a concealed position, and you're going to watch our flank. If you see so much as a Japanese cook sharpening a knife, you call us. You understand?" He stared at the map, then at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Alone, Sergeant. You're a hunter, right, from Montana?" I sneered. "You're supposed to be good at this stuff. Being quiet, watching. This is your chance to be useful for a change. Don't screw it up." It was a suicide mission, and we both knew it. The flank was the most dangerous place to be. If there were any Japanese patrols, he'd be the first to find them. The chances of him making it back were slim to none. It was a cold-blooded calculation. I was sacrificing a piece I considered worthless to potentially save the rest. I was sending a lamb to the slaughter to clear the path for the lions. The other men heard. They looked at Davis with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was being cast out. Preacher caught my eye, a question in his gaze. I looked away. Davis, to his credit, didn't argue. He just squared his narrow shoulders, his face pale but set. "Yes, Sergeant." I tossed him a spool of wire and the heavy black field phone. "Here, don't lose it, and don't call me unless you see a tank division. I don't want to hear you crying because you saw a monkey." He gathered the gear, his movements clumsy, his hands shaking again. He looked so young, so hopelessly out of his depth. For a fleeting second, I felt a pang of something that might have been guilt. I crushed it. This was war. Sentiment was a luxury we couldn't afford. He turned and walked away, a solitary figure disappearing into the twilight, dragging his wire behind him. I didn't expect to see him again. I didn't want to. He was a problem, and I had just solved it. "All right," I said, turning back to my real soldiers, the men I was counting on. "Let's get ready. We've got a real mission to plan." I didn't look back in the direction Davis had gone. In my mind, he was already dead. Moving through the jungle at night is like being swallowed. The darkness is absolute. A thick black velvet that smothers sound and sight. You lose all sense of direction, all sense of distance. Your world shrinks to the man in front of you, a vague plodding shadow that you follow by the faint squelch of his boots in the mud. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounds like an entire enemy platoon. Your imagination becomes your worst enemy. It populates the shadows with shapes, turns rotting logs into machine gun nests, and twists the dangling vines into waiting soldiers. We moved like ghosts, a column of weary phantoms drifting through hell. Chensky was on point, and he was the best. He moved with an innate sense of the terrain, his feet finding solid ground where there was only muck, his body weaving through the tangled vegetation without a sound. We trusted him with our lives, and he had never let us down. I was in the middle of the column, right behind Lieutenant Harris and his radio man. The lieutenant was trying his best to be a soldier, moving in a low crouch, his carbine held at the ready. But he was clumsy. He was a city boy, and the jungle knew it. He snagged his gear on thorns, stumbled over roots, and twice I had to reach out and steady him before he went crashing to the ground. He was a hazard, almost as much as Davis had been. But he was an officer. I couldn't just send him off to a lonely ridge. I had to keep him alive. That was the job. As we moved, my thoughts kept drifting back, unwanted, to the western ridge. I tried not to think about Davis. I told myself he was gone, a piece jettisoned from the machine to save the rest. It was a clean, logical decision. But war is never clean, and logic is a poor comfort in the dark. I pictured him out there, alone. I imagined his fear, a cold, solitary thing in the vast, indifferent jungle. I wondered if he was already dead, a quiet casualty of a war he never understood. A part of me, a small, stubborn part I thought I had buried long ago, hoped he'd found a deep hole and was smart enough to stay in it until morning. Then I cursed myself for the weakness. Hope was a poison out here. It made you soft. We reached the base of the cliff an hour before dawn. It was even worse than it looked on the map. A sheer rock face slick with moss and rainwater, draped in a curtain of thick, woody vines. It was a 100-foot climb straight up, We formed a perimeter in the swampy ground at its base, the men sinking to their knees in the stinking, stagnant water, weapons pointing out into the darkness. The air was cool now, and the dampness seeped into our bones, a deep, persistent chill that no amount of movement could shake. We waited for the signal, listening to the chorus of the jungle night, the chirping of insects, the guttural croak of frogs, the distant cry of some nocturnal bird, and under it all, the steady, maddening drip, drip, drip of water. The signal came just as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky. A single muffled pop from a flare gun far to our south. That was our cue. It was meant to be the diversion, a feint by another company to draw the enemy's attention. "Let's go," Harris whispered, his voice tight with excitement. "Rope team up." Chensky and Brooklyn, our strongest climbers, went first. They moved up the cliff face like spiders, using the thick vines as ropes, finding handholds and footholds in the rock that were invisible from below. It was a terrifying, breathtaking display of skill and courage. They secured ropes at the top, and the rest of us began the slow, agonizing ascent, our heavy gear dragging us down, our boots scrabbling for purchase on the slippery rock. It was exhausting work. Men slipped, cursed, and dangled precariously from the ropes before finding their footing again. By the time I hauled myself over the crest, my lungs were burning and my arms felt like lead. We were there, the top of the ridge. We had done it. A wave of relief, premature and dangerous, washed over me. The Japanese position was supposed to be 200 yards ahead, just beyond a thick grove of bamboo. So far, so good. Harris was flushed with success. He looked at me, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "See, Sergeant?" Textbook. I didn't answer. I was listening. It was too quiet. After the diversionary attack, the jungle should have been alive with sound. Shouting, maybe a few stray shots, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the bamboo. It felt wrong. My gut, an organ I had learned to trust more than any intelligence report, was screaming at me. "Something's not right, Lieutenant," I said in a low voice. "It's a trap." "Nonsense, Miller," he scoffed. "We have the element of surprise. They're all looking south. Now, let's move out and finish this." He gave the hand signal and the platoon began to advance, spreading out in a skirmish line. We moved into the bamboo grove. The tall green stalks grew so close together they formed a kind of claustrophobic tunnel. The light was dim, filtered through the dense canopy of leaves above. It was a perfect place for an ambush. Every man knew it. The tension was a physical thing, a tight band around my chest. We moved one step at a time, rifles up, eyes scanning the shadows. We made it 50 yards into the bamboo before the world exploded. It wasn't one gun, it was a dozen. They opened up on us from 3 sides at once. The sound of the Japanese machine guns, the Nambu and the Type 92, was a terrifying, ripping chatter that tore the air apart. It was different from our guns, higher pitched, faster. It sounded like the world was being torn like canvas. The bamboo stalks around us disintegrated into green splinters. Leaves and dirt flew everywhere. Men screamed and fell. The front of our line simply ceased to exist, mowed down in the first volley. Chensky, our rock, our guide, was gone. Brooklyn, the kid from East LA, was cut in half by a burst from a heavy gun. "Ambush!" Harris screamed, stating the obvious. "Take cover!" We dove for whatever pathetic cover we could find. The base of a bamboo clump, a shallow depression in the ground. I landed behind a rotting log that wouldn't stop a pistol round, let alone the storm of steel that was scything through the air. The Japanese had been waiting for us. They knew our route. They had let us climb that cliff and walk right into their killing ground. The unoccupied ridge wasn't unoccupied at all. It was the bait. And we were the fish. A grenade, a Type 97, landed a few feet from me with a soft thud. I scrambled away, pressing myself into the mud as it went off with a deafening concussion that rattled my teeth. Shrapnel whizzed over my head. I could hear the medic, a man named Henderson, yelling for casualties, his voice cracking with panic. I can't get to them. They're all pinned down. Our own bars opened up, trying to provide some suppressing fire. But it was useless. We didn't know where to shoot. The muzzle flashes were coming from everywhere, hidden in expertly camouflaged spider holes and log bunkers. We were caught in a classic L-shaped ambush, a perfectly executed trap. The radio man, a kid named Schiller, crawled over to the lieutenant. "I can't raise anyone, sir. The radio's been hit." He held up the handset, which had been shattered by a bullet. We were cut off, alone. Harris was in shock. His textbook plan had dissolved into a bloodbath in 30 seconds. He was staring at the carnage, his face ashen, his mouth hanging open. The confident officer was gone, replaced by a terrified boy. I crawled over to him, keeping my head down as bullets snapped over me, so close I could feel their heat. "Lieutenant, we have to pull back. We have to get out of the kill zone." He didn't respond. He was gone, his mind checked out. The 1,000-yard stare had found him. "Preacher," I yelled. "Pop smoke! We need cover!" Preacher, pinned down behind a small hummock, pulled the pin on a smoke grenade and lobbed it into the center of our position. A thick cloud of white smoke billowed out, providing a momentary screen. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Fall back," I screamed. "Back to the cliff edge. Move!" The men who could still move began to crawl backward, dragging the wounded with them. The Japanese, sensing our retreat, intensified their fire. They began to fire mortars, the shells crashing down into the bamboo, sending deadly shards of wood and steel flying in all directions. It was chaos, a whirlpool of noise and death. We made it back to the edge of the ridge, a ragged, bleeding collection of survivors. We'd lost half the platoon in 5 minutes. Harris was among the wounded, a piece of shrapnel in his leg. He was conscious now but useless, moaning in pain. The medic was dead, killed by a mortar round as he tried to reach a fallen man. We were in a desperate situation. The Japanese were starting to move, flanking us, getting ready to finish us off. I took stock of our position. We had maybe 15 men left who could still fight. We were low on ammo. Our backs were to a 100-foot drop. The enemy was in front of us, dug in and waiting. They held all the cards. I looked at Preacher, his face grim, streaked with mud and blood from a graze on his cheek. "This is it, Frank," he said, his voice quiet. "This is a bad one." He was right. I had been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. There was no way out. We were going to die on this miserable, forgotten hilltop. My mind raced, trying to find an angle, a plan, a miracle. There was nothing. I had led my men into this. My decision to trust the lieutenant, to follow the plan even when my gut told me it was wrong, had doomed us. And in that moment of despair, I didn't even think about the kid, Davis. He was a ghost, a memory from another lifetime. He was on another ridge, in another world. He was the least of my problems. We were completely surrounded, completely outgunned, and our luck had finally run out. The trap had sprung, and we were caught in its teeth. I chambered a fresh clip into my Thompson, the familiar, heavy click, a small, final comfort. If we were going to die here, we were going to make it expensive for them. Time gets funny when you know you're about to die. Seconds stretch into minutes, minutes into hours. Every heartbeat is a drumbeat, counting down your last moments. We were pressed against the cliff's edge, a pathetic little island of defiance in a sea of enemy fire. The Japanese were getting bolder, creeping forward through the bamboo, their voices a series of sharp, guttural barks. They were coordinating, preparing for the final rush that would sweep us off the ridge and into oblivion. We returned fire sparingly, each shot a carefully aimed prayer. Ammo was everything. Preacher was on my left, firing his M1 in a slow, steady rhythm. He wasn't wasting a single round. On my right, Gonzalez's brother, a quiet kid named Miguel, who had taken over the bar after Brooklyn fell, was firing in short, controlled bursts, trying to keep their heads down. But there were too many of them. For every one we pinned, 3 more would move up. They set up another machine gun on our left flank, in a position that gave them a clear field of fire into our shallow cover. The first burst ripped through our line, kicking up dirt and rock. A man named Goldstein screamed and went silent. Another, a corporal from the second squad, clutched his chest and rolled over. The gun was chewing us to pieces. We were completely exposed to it, with no way to maneuver and no cover deep enough to protect us. "We've got to take out that gun," I yelled over the din. But it was a hopeless command. It was dug into a log bunker 200 yards away. A frontal assault was suicide, and we had nothing left to flank with. Miguel swung his bar around and emptied a full magazine at the bunker's firing slit. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the logs, having no effect. The Japanese gunner didn't even pause. He just kept hammering us, the relentless chatter of his Type 92 a death sentence. This was it, the end of the line. I looked at the faces of my men, the few that were left. They were scared, but they weren't broken. They were soldiers. They would fight to the last man, to the last bullet. A strange sense of calm washed over me. There was no more planning, no more tactics, no more hope. There was only the fight. I sighted my Thompson on a shadow moving in the trees and squeezed the trigger. And then something impossible happened. From somewhere far away in a direction I couldn't place came a single sharp crack. It was immediately followed by the distinctive ping of an M1 Garand ejecting its clip. But this sound was different from the frantic, desperate shots of my own men. It was slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in a brief lull in the fighting. In the Japanese machine gun bunker, the stream of tracer fire suddenly stopped. An officer who had been directing fire from behind the bunker, waving a sword in classic fashion, stiffened and fell forward as if poleaxed. He didn't twitch. The jungle fell silent for a heartbeat. Everyone on both sides seemed to be holding their breath. What the hell was that? Then the Japanese soldiers, confused and angry, began shouting again. Their remaining machine gun opened up, spraying bullets wildly in our direction. But the spell was broken. Something had changed. Another crack. This time, I was watching for it. I saw a puff of dirt kick up next to a Japanese mortar crew that was setting up behind their main line. One of the crewmen dropped his shell and crumpled to the ground. The others scattered, looking around in confusion. They weren't looking at us. They were looking behind them into the jungle on the far side of their own position. "What in God's name is going on?" Preacher whispered, his eyes wide. "I have no idea," I said. But for the first time in an hour, the cold, hard knot of despair in my stomach loosened just a little. "But I'll take it. Miguel, give me covering fire. Aim for that other Nambu." Miguel let out a war cry and opened up with the bar, pouring a stream of 30 caliber rounds into the second machine gun nest. The Japanese gunner ducked, and their fire slackened. Crack! A Japanese NCO, trying to rally his men for an assault, spun around and fell. The shot had come from the same unseen position. It was methodical, patient, deadly. It was like watching a master surgeon at work, cutting out the key pieces of the enemy's command structure one by one. The Japanese were starting to panic. Their perfect ambush had been turned on its head. They were being attacked from the rear by an enemy they couldn't see. They were firing wildly into the trees behind them, their discipline evaporating into fear. Who was it? A lost patrol? Another company that had somehow broken through? It made no sense. There was no one else up here but us. Then, a grenade sailed out from the jungle behind them and landed squarely in the second machine gun nest. The explosion was a dull crump, followed by screams. The gun went silent. That was the moment, the opportunity. Their line was in chaos. Their heavy weapons were silenced. Their leaders were dead. It was a gift from God or the devil, I didn't care which. It was a chance. "They're spooked," I yelled. "Hey, they're falling apart. Let's hit them. Fix bayonets." The command was pure instinct. It was a mad gamble, a charge by a handful of wounded, exhausted men against a superior force. But war is won on moments of madness. My men, sensing the shift in the battle, let out a ragged, desperate cheer. The sound of bayonets clicking into place was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. "On my signal," I shouted, pulling a fresh magazine into my Thompson. "Let's go send these bastards to their ancestors." I looked across the shattered bamboo grove at the enemy line. They were disorganized, terrified, firing at shadows in their own rear. They had no idea where the real threat was coming from anymore. This ghost, whoever he was, had completely unnerved them. He had done more damage with a handful of bullets than my entire platoon had with all its firepower. He had given us a chance to live. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know how he had gotten there. In the heat of the moment, I didn't even try to figure it out. All I knew was that a phantom had come out of the jungle to save us. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of cordite and blood and wet earth. I raised my arm, ready to give the signal for the charge, my heart pounding with a wild, terrible hope. We were still going to die, probably. But now, thanks to our ghost, we were going to die on our feet, charging forward instead of cowering in a ditch. And in the stinking, godforsaken jungle, that was a victory in itself. There's a fire that gets lit in a man during a bayonet charge. It's not bravery, not really. It's something older, something primal. It's a surrender to the moment, a complete and total release of everything except the will to move forward and kill. Fear, exhaustion, pain. It all burns away, leaving behind a pure, crystalline rage. As I dropped my arm and screamed, "Charge!" that fire roared to life in the hearts of my men. We surged over our meager cover and into the shattered bamboo grove. The 15 of us who were left sounded like a whole company, our throats raw with a single unified battle cry. It was a mad, glorious, terrible sound. The Japanese, who had been focused on the unseen threat in their rear, were caught completely by surprise. Their heads snapped around, their eyes wide with disbelief as a wave of ragged, mud-caked American devils came screaming out of the smoke, bayonets gleaming. The first few yards were the worst. Their riflemen recovered quickly and a volley of fire tore through our thin line. I saw 2 men go down, their charge cut short. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. To stop was to die. I fired my Thompson from the hip, not aiming, just spraying, the weapon bucking in my hands. The goal wasn't to hit anything, it was to make them keep their heads down. We crashed into their forward positions like a tidal wave. It wasn't a firefight anymore. It was a brawl. A Japanese soldier leaped out of a spider hole, his bayonet leveled. I didn't even have time to think. I sidestepped, brought the butt of my Thompson around in a vicious arc, and felt the sickening crunch as it connected with his jaw. He dropped without a sound. To my left, Preacher, his face a mask of grim determination, engaged in a desperate duel with an enemy officer. Steel rang against steel, a deadly dance of parry and thrust. I saw the officer's sword flash, but Preacher was faster, his M1 a clumsy but effective spear. He lunged, and the fight was over. We were losing men, but we were gaining ground. We fought with a ferocity born of desperation. We were dead men already, and that made us invincible. We pushed them back through their own trenches, past the bodies of their comrades. But the core of their resistance was a heavy machine gun bunker on a small rise at the back of their position. It had been silenced by the grenade from our Ghost, but now a fresh crew was scrambling to get it back into action. If they succeeded, our charge would be stopped dead, and we would be slaughtered in the open. "At the bunker!" I screamed, pointing with my Thompson. "Take the bunker!" Miguel, the bar gunner, understood immediately. He dropped to one knee, providing a base of fire, his weapon hammering away at the bunker's opening, keeping the new crew pinned down. But he was drawing all their attention. Rifle fire converged on his position from all sides. "I'm out!" he yelled, the bar falling silent as he fumbled for a new magazine. That was the moment they were waiting for. The Japanese gunner finally got the Type 92 working. He swung the heavy barrel towards us, and I saw the glint of the ammo belt being fed into the chamber. It was over. We were 50 yards away, completely exposed. There was no cover, no escape. My heart froze. And then, for the last time, the Ghost spoke. Crack. The shot came from the jungle high on the ridge to the west. The ridge I had sent Davis to. I was watching the bunker, and I saw it happen as if in slow motion. The Japanese gunner's helmet flew from his head, and he slumped over his weapon without ever firing a shot. The remaining Japanese soldiers stared at their fallen gunner, then looked in horror towards the source of the shot. Their morale, already shattered, completely disintegrated. They had been fighting specters. They were trapped between a bayonet charge they couldn't stop and a sniper they couldn't see. They broke. They dropped their rifles and fled, melting back into the jungle from which they had come. The silence that followed was more shocking than the noise. There was only the ringing in my ears, the ragged gasps of my men, and the soft whisper of the wind through the bullet-shredded bamboo. It was over. We had won. We had taken the ridge. We stood there for a long moment, dazed, leaning on our rifles, trying to comprehend that we were still alive. We had started with a platoon of nearly 40 men. I counted 8 of us left standing. 8. The cost had been staggering. My eyes were fixed on the western ridge. Who was he? Who was the angel of death who had saved us? I expected to see a phantom emerge from the trees, some legendary scout I had only heard stories about. Instead, the figure that stumbled out of the jungle and into the clearing was small, covered in mud and blood, and painfully familiar. He was limping, using his M1 Garand as a crutch. His uniform was torn, his face was a mess of scratches, and there was a dark, wet stain spreading on his shoulder. But his eyes were different. The fear was gone. In its place was a look of profound, bone-deep exhaustion. but also a hard, steady calm. It was Davis. He walked past the abandoned Japanese positions, past the bodies of the men he had killed, his steps slow and deliberate. My men stared at him, their mouths agape. They looked from the dead Japanese officer to the silenced mortar pit to the dead machine gunner, and then back to the kid. The impossible math was adding up in their heads. He stopped in front of me. He didn't salute. He just leaned heavily on his rifle and looked me in the eye. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I was looking at a stranger. The terrified, clumsy boy I had sent off to die was gone. In his place stood a soldier. "Hill is secure, Sergeant," he said, his voice raspy, low. "I ran into a bit of trouble on the way up. Figured I should report." "Trouble," I repeated, my voice hollow. I looked back at the carnage, at the perfectly executed dismantling of a fortified enemy position. "You call this trouble?" He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "When I got to the ridge you sent me to, I saw them. The whole company. They weren't just on this hill. They were dug in all along the approach, waiting for us. I tried the field phone, but the line was dead. Must have gotten cut." He took a breath, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "I knew you guys were walking into a trap. I couldn't warn you, so I figured the only thing to do was to flank the flankers." My mind struggled to process it. He had seen the trap, and instead of hiding, instead of running, this kid, who was too scared to dig his own foxhole, had crossed the valley alone, climbed another ridge, and single-handedly taken on an entire reinforced Japanese company from the rear. "How?" Preacher asked, his voice full of awe. "How did you do it, kid?" Davis looked down at his rifle, at the scarred walnut stock. "Back home in Montana," he said quietly, "my dad and I used to hunt elk in the high country. You learn things up there. You learn to be quiet. You learn to watch the wind. You learn that you can wait all day for one good shot, because that one shot is all you've got. These fellas, they were loud. They weren't watching their backs. They never knew I was there until it was too late." He had used his skill, the very thing that made him seem out of place here, his quiet, watchful nature, born of a life in the wilderness, had been the key to our survival. He hadn't just followed my order, he had understood the intent behind it, to provide warning, and when the original plan failed, he had adapted. He had done what a real soldier does. He had taken the initiative. I looked at him, at the blood on his uniform and the old man's look in his young eyes. I saw the cost of what he had done. I thought about how I had used him, how I had thrown him away like a broken piece of gear. My contempt, my cynicism, had almost gotten us all killed. His courage, the courage I had refused to see, had saved us. There were no words for that. No apology could cover it. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, and for the first time, I saw him clearly. Then I gave him a single sharp nod. It was all I had. Later that day, after we had collected our wounded and accounted for our dead, we sat in the captured Japanese trench, waiting for reinforcements. The reality of our losses had settled in, a heavy, silent grief. I was cleaning my Thompson when Davis came and sat down a few feet away. He was working on his M1, his movements now sure and practiced. The medic from the relief company had patched up his shoulder. We sat in silence for a long time. The jungle, which had been a place of so much violence, was now quiet, indifferent. I unscrewed the cap from my canteen, the one I kept filled with captured Japanese whiskey instead of water. I took a long swallow, the raw spirit burning a welcome trail down my throat. Then, without a word, I held it out to him. He looked at the canteen, then at me. He hesitated for a second, then took it. He wiped the mouth with the sleeve of his uniform, took a slow, measured sip, and handed it back. He didn't need to say thank you. I didn't need to say I was sorry. In the quiet language of soldiers, everything that needed to be said had just passed between us. He was one of us now. He was part of the brotherhood. The kid from Montana had found his place, and I had been humbled by the brutal, undeniable truth of his courage. He was no longer the rookie. He was the soldier who had saved us all.